It's wonderful to see so many of you here. Our speakers this evening are Dr. Geoffrey Tyack and Dr. Stephen Parissien. Geoffrey is an architectural historian and teaches on the MSc in English Local History and supervises DPhil students. He is also, among other things, a contributor to the Cambridge Companion to John Ruskin. And Stephen is a cultural historian, museum director, and lecturer in architectural history at the Department for Continuing Education. So without further ado, I'm going to hand you over to Geoffrey and Stephen. Thank you.
Thank you, Rebecca. Good evening, everyone. Lovely to see such an impressive audience. Lovely to see faces too. I wish my students would do this. What we're going to do this evening is Geoffrey's going to start with a short visual presentation. We thought it would be a great shame if there were no visuals given the subject matter of Ruskin. And then following that, I will ask Geoffrey a few questions. And then following that, we will throw it all open to the floor. So when we do, I'll remind you again, but if you wish to ask a question in that part, please do raise your electronic hand if you could. And could you now make sure that you are muted? Lovely to see your faces, but if you could make sure you are muted, that'd be very kind. It's my great pleasure to introduce Geoffrey Tyack. I've known Geoffrey for many years, a great expert on so many facets of particularly 18th and 19th century architecture. And we're very fortunate to have Geoffrey here to give the annual Ruskin lecture. Geoffrey.
Well, first of all, I need to share my screen. And so John Ruskin, why are we celebrating John Ruskin? In some ways, I think that Ruskin is the secular patron saint of Kellogg College, in that so many of his ideas are the ideas and ideals that have been shared by us as members of the college ever since its foundation. Lifelong learning, a very wide range of interests, both in the sciences and in the humanities, and a questioning attitude, which stayed with him throughout his fairly long life. He died at the age of 81. So who was he? He was the only child of a wealthy sherry merchant in London and his very protective Scottish wife, both of whom were strict evangelicals. And I think that's an important thing to remember about Ruskin. He was brought up in London, first in Bloomsbury, then in Camberwell. There's actually a Ruskin Park in Camberwell, which is on the site of the family home, one of the family homes. He was educated from home. He never went to school, and then in 1837. He came to Christ Church in Oxford and lived there for the next 3 or 4 years intermittently, graduating in 1842 with, interestingly, an honorary double 4th class degree. Which gives you an idea of his rather unconventional attitude to many things. Ruskin's parents took him on tours around Britain as a boy, really, and then as a young man. That's partly because his father was a partner in the firm of Domecq, who were sherry merchants, and he went around looking for clients and so on, and he took little John Ruskin with him. And little John Ruskin absorbed the beauty of nature, immensely important, and also the beauty of buildings embodying the history of the nation, which I think is part of their charm for Ruskin. And we see here one of his early architectural drawings. It's a sketch very much in the style of the picturesque. People at the time were admiring the remains of old vernacular buildings, many of which were later swept away by so-called improvements. But above all, he was fascinated by the beauty of nature, especially mountain scenery in the north of England and in Scotland. And we'll be returning to Brantwood and Lake Coniston at the end of my short introduction. It's worth remembering that Ruskin was an artist as well as an art critic. He's most famous today for his criticism, his art criticism and his social criticism, but he was a very accomplished artist, drawing on nature, which he believed should be the source of inspiration for everybody, in fact, and for artists in particular. He went abroad for the first time with his parents in 1833 and was overwhelmed by the beauty of the Alps and their, what people at the time would have called their sublimity, the sense of scale in comparison with the smallness of human beings. And you can see this in the drawing on the left that he made. He had a minute interest in geology. He was fascinated with rocks and liked to draw them and paint them in enormous detail. And you can see that on the right-hand image of a rock face in Scotland, where he went. He went abroad for the first time in 1833, but his parents also gave him, as a boy, in fact, a book on Italy illustrated with engravings after the greatest of all English artists, in my opinion at least, J.M.W. Turner. And Ruskin later collected Turner pictures, many of which in fact were later given to the Ashmolean Museum, where you can see this beautiful watercolor of a view on the River Loire. Turner was fascinated by light, and you can see that in this picture, and in particular light as seen through mist is a theme that comes up in a lot of Turner's art. And in fact, Ruskin became so obsessed with Turner that he began to write a book in which he celebrates his abilities, his genius, I should say, as an artist. And that book was called Modern Painters. And essentially the whole thing was a paean of praise to Turner, extolling his art. He later went on to produce more volumes in which he also explored his own fascination with medieval and early Renaissance art. He didn't like Baroque art. He thought that it didn't show the same attention to nature. It was too imprecise, and he loathed a lot of contemporary art, which he thought was basically trivial. And so he first made his mark, I think it's fair to say, as an art critic, and he was widely read. I'm not sure how widely read he is nowadays, because his style puts an awful lot of people off. He was very orotund and sometimes over dogmatic, I think, to modern tastes. But it's worth persevering with Ruskin, especially selecting versions of it. And then in 1848, he got married, but the marriage was not a success it was in fact never consummated, and nobody's ever really worked out why. But a lot of ink has been spilt on that subject, and I don't propose to go into that in any more detail, because I really want to focus on his art. But that his marriage is important for this picture, which took place when he went with his wife on a holiday to Glenfinlas in Scotland, along with the painter John Everett Millais, who was one of the pre-Raphaelite artists that Ruskin praised in his own work. Ruskin saw the pre-Raphaelites as going back to a serious study of nature, and especially through, again, painting in this minute detail with very brilliant colours. And he saw this as the way forward, and he saw Millais as what I think, certainly for what it's worth, is the most talented of the pre-Raphaelites, although in later years his art, I think, rather fell off. But this was painted at the height of his fame and at the height of his genius in 1853, just before, in fact, Ruskin's marriage broke up, and his wife married for a second time, Millais, and had a happy family, and so on. So you can see there the what Ruskin meant by a quote, by a statement he made about pre-Raphaelitism. And I'm going to read that. Go to nature in all singleness of heart, selecting nothing, rejecting nothing, scorning nothing. So in other words, good art is naturalistic art and very painstaking. Now, Ruskin first showed an interest in architecture as a young man. In fact, the very year he first went to Oxford as an undergraduate, 1837, when he wrote an essay called The Poetry of Architecture, which isn't much read nowadays, but it's worth reading. He talks about some of the themes that he later developed in much more detail in two books. First of all, The Seven Lamps of Architecture, in which he tried to explain what made good architecture good. And that's a very difficult thing. If you've spent a lot of your life lecturing, as I and Stephen have, on architecture, it's very easy to say what happened. It's not so easy as to say why some things are more good than others. And for Ruskin, what made good architecture good was, to a very large extent, the degree of craftsmanship showed in the building. It wasn't the only thing by any means, but that's what he's bringing out in this picture from the Stones of Venice of part of the Doge's Palace in Venice, which Ruskin first went to in the late 1840s and returned to again and again and again afterwards. Venice for Ruskin was not only a beautiful place with lovely buildings, but it was also a kind of parable of what happens to nations in history. They rise, they reach a peak of beauty, and then they fall. And he was fascinated with not only Venice's rise, but also Venice's fall. And he saw that as something that could be applied, of course, to a modern nation such as our own. He saw it partly as a result of overweening pride and selfishness, actually, among many other things too, Ruskin's books were very widely read. The Seven Lamps of Architecture, and also the book that followed that called The Stones of Venice, in which he looked at Venice in very great detail. Among the people who read those books was the chief promoter of the Oxford University Museum, Henry Ackland, and he and Ruskin were very much involved in the genesis of this fascinating Gothic design. And Ruskin, indeed, as we'll see in a second, did produce some designs for the building, which were never, in fact, executed. The man who did design the building was an architect called Benjamin Woodward, extremely talented, very much a follower of Ruskin's belief in Gothic as the best style, not only for churches, and people have been building Gothic churches for years, but also for secular buildings. And that was, he believed, Ruskin and Woodward, because it allowed some scope for the creative input of the workman, the craftsman. Ruskin believed that when you look at a medieval Gothic cathedral, you're fascinated partly by the grandeur and the sublimity of it, the sense of space and light, but also the detailed craftsmanship. And what Ruskin thought was good about that was that the craftsman was not just copying something from a book or a drawing by the architect, but the craftsman was given some agency in the building. And it was, of course, usually a he, almost always at this stage. He had a creative impact, and you can see that in this photograph of one of the two O'Shea brothers who came from Ireland, where Woodward had actually designed buildings before, to do the carving around the windows. And you can see that if you go to the University Museum today. What you will also see is that not all the windows were carved, and the reason for that was that the money ran out, surprise, surprise, and some of the windows were never carved. But what we see in this museum is not only this beautiful stone carving and this use of what people began to call modern Gothic, but also applying new materials, and above all iron, to Gothic architecture. And there, Ruskin parted company with Woodward and the university. He thought that iron should not be used, except perhaps in a hidden way in buildings, because it does not show the craftsmanship of the worker, the craftsman. He believed that it was just mechanical, which I think is unfair. If you look at the ironwork in the museum, it's the most spectacular building. I'm sure most of you know it. And you can see the way that the iron arches, designed by a Coventry ironmaster called Francis Skidmore, in a sense echoes the bones of the dinosaurs there. So that really is modern Gothic, but it's also bringing out the naturalness of Gothic as Ruskin saw it. Now, just stand with the university museum behind you. You see Keble College, and that was designed by the man who I believe was the greatest of all Victorian Gothic architects, who was William Butterfield. And the question arises to what extent, and in fact, we're going to be talking about this later, Butterfield was influenced by Ruskin. And I'll talk a little bit about that. But it is true that if you look at the front of Keble College, or indeed anything in Keble College, and the interior of the amazing chapel there, what really strikes you is colour. And when Ruskin wrote his Stones of Venice, he actually included some colour prints there. And one of them is of this arch in the cathedral at Murano, which is one of the islands in the Venetian lagoon. And you can see the colour there. Now, what is the relevance of that to Kellogg College? Well, the relevance of that is that the man for whom number 62 Banbury Road was built, the Reverend Tyrwhitt, who was the vicar of St Mary Magdalene's Church, was himself an admirer of Ruskin and a very formidable amateur artist, among many other accomplishments. And he actually invited Ruskin to his house a couple of times. So when we go through the door of number 62, we are actually treading in the great man's footsteps, which is something that has been revealed above all by the scholarship of our colleague Malcolm Ayres, who has given some interesting talks on this very subject. And what we're looking at here is one of the houses of the St John's College North Oxford estate. Notice the way that it's built of brick. It's got an irregular plan and an irregular exterior, but above all, it has Gothic detailing with the kind of carving that entrances us so much in ancient medieval Gothic buildings. The carving over the doorway here is enigmatic, let's say. It's supposed to illustrate some verses from the book of Proverbs, which I'm not going to read out to you, chapter 30, verse 29, with the goat and the animals and so on and so forth. And then above that, an enigmatic figure holding a kind of wand or stick. It's probably designed by or made by a man called J. Hungerford Pollen, who worked, did the paintings on the ceiling of Merton College Chapel, and it's very much in the Ruskinian mode. So Ruskin is in a sense the patron of that, and you can see Pollen at work too in the archway on the right at the entrance to the University Museum. Now, in his later life, Ruskin went in a new direction. He had become more and more interested, not just in art, but in society and the relationship of the two. And he returned to Oxford to give 2 sets of Slade lectures. He was the first Slade Professor of Fine Art. And this is from the second one here, in which he is talking about the ideal home. Not a compartment of a model lodging house, not number so-and-so of Paradise Row, but a cottage all of our own, with its little garden, its pleasant view, its surrounding fields, its neighbouring stream, its healthy air, and clean kitchen, parlours, and bedrooms. Less than this, no man should be content with for his nest. More than this, few should seek. But he goes on to say it's something that all science, true art, and true literature should aim to overcome. And bear in mind that this was written at the time of the height of the Industrial Revolution, with more and more people cramming into what are still in many ways very unhealthy industrial towns, smog-ridden and so on. And Ruskin is looking for something better. And he inspired a whole generation of people who came towards the end of the 19th century. And among those were the were the founders of the Garden City movement, and they were in turn following the inspiration of perhaps Ruskin's greatest disciple, who was William Morris. And you get a series of people at the end of the 19th century who tried to put Ruskin's and Morris's ideals into practice in the first garden cities at Letchworth and then later at Welwyn, in which you bring together domestic buildings and nature. And that's something that had a huge impact on the way we live now in the 21st century. And part of that was Ruskin's concern for nature and domesticated nature in people's gardens. And after he moved to Brantwood in 1872, he and the people who lived with him there developed a very beautiful garden, which you can actually go and see. This house is open to the public. It's on the east side of Lake Coniston in Cumbria. Ruskin designed, he wasn't a particularly good architect, I have to say, but the house is a bit of a mishmash, but the garden is absolutely lovely. And it's a kind of organized, domesticated nature. And if you look at the bottom image, this is very much what we at Kellogg College hope we can achieve through the good offices and genius of Andy Sturgeon, who has prepared some drawings for what the gardens of Kellogg College might look like in the future. And that's something I think that we can all look forward to. And in a sense, you could say that Ruskin's spirit will live on in the future as it does now. And I just want to conclude with a sentence from, I think, Ruskin, in many ways, Ruskin's most profound book, which was called Unto This Last, which is basically a book on political economy. And he comes up with this memorable statement, which is actually inscribed on his monument in Westminster Abbey. There is no wealth but life. Wealth is not accumulating riches, it's leading a good life. And I think despite the fact that Ruskin's own last years were marred by depression and bouts of insanity, I think his legacy has lived on and it can continue to inspire us still. I've put down a few lists of things you might want to read. I imagine you'll be able to get hold of this presentation. The library of John Ruskin books is huge, but I put some suggestions here that you might want to read. And I do recommend you to read some of what Ruskin wrote himself, especially in an anthology. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Geoffrey. That was brilliant. Thank you. A really, really helpful introduction. Can I just kick off by asking, where did Ruskin's ideas come from? Where did his idea that great art came from nature come from? Was it his boyhood holidays in the Lake District, do you think?
Well, that certainly has a large part. I mean, when I think of Ruskin, he was an extremely sensitive man. He was very open to impressions, and I think that applies right from his earliest childhood, when his parents took him all over the place, especially to the lakes, and there's no accident that he eventually settled there by Lake Coniston. So I think they came from that. I think the holidays, but also from his own very wide and voracious reading. The idea that great art comes from nature is something that, of course, people had said for from time immemorial, but he was restating it for a generation of people for whom the beauty of nature seems to be under threat from industrialization, just as it seems to be under threat for us today, which is, I think, one of the strongest parts of his relevance to us.
Great, thank you, Geoffrey. Yeah, Geoffrey, you mentioned the Seven Lamps of Architecture, which laid down his guidelines for aesthetic appreciation for true principled architecture, based on the reception of beauty drawn from nature. How it was hugely influential then. Do you think it's still influential today? Does it have a role to play?
I think it was, it was obviously extremely influential then. In a sense, Seven Lamps was, I'm not sure it was a bestseller, but a lot of people read it. It had a huge influence on architects, but also on anybody who looked at buildings. He wanted us to use our eyes better. I think that's really important for him. And that's why I think it's important for us now. But I have to say that his style puts people off nowadays in many ways. He's very prolix, which is why he's best read in anthology. He also pontificates rather more than people like nowadays. He tends to mount the pulpit. Although he actually lost his faith later on, he never shook off the sense of the evangelical sermons that he heard as a boy, I think. And something of that sermonizing comes into his writings.
Thank you. You've looked at the University Museum and said how, it implied how dissatisfied Ruskin was with the finished article. Across the road, Keble College is, on the face of it, less an expression of nature as an exploration, as you showed, of structural polychromy. Yet Butterfield, as you said, always acknowledged Ruskin as a crucial influence. Where does nature fit in at Keble, do you think?
Well, let's look at the two buildings together, I think, the University Museum and Keble, because they do epitomise, to my mind, the best of Victorian architecture anywhere. So if we start with the University Museum, I think he was very successful, or the architect was very successful, and the craftsman in drawing on nature there. I mean, you see that all over the University Museum, not only in the entrance, but if you go inside and then go upstairs to the gallery and walk around the gallery, what you will see there are columns supporting pointed arches, which are of different kinds of stone quarried in the British Isles. And in an absolutely typical Victorian way, they are all categorized. There's a little inscription below each capital saying where the stone came from. Yeah. Absolutely typical of the period. And so, in a sense, the structure of the building becomes part of the museum exhibits, and it embodies nature. And in the same way, I would say that the iron roof reflects the bones of the dinosaurs. So I would say very much in the University Museum, much less, I think, in Butterfield's Keble College. And I think there's a reason for that. And I think the reason is that whereas Ruskin became a religious skeptic eventually, he was continually trying to break away from the evangelicalism of his parents. Butterfield was an absolutely orthodox high church Anglican right the way through his life. And the most important thing for him in Keble College was to proclaim the truths of the faith. And the only way you can possibly understand, especially the interior of of Keble College Chapel is through that lens. He believed that a medieval church proclaimed the faith in a very explicit way, and he wanted his own college to do the same. So if we turn from the chapel to the rest of the college, it's almost like a kind of a set of monastic buildings. And I think the students, many of whom, of course, became Anglican clergymen, for them it was a kind of quasi religious seminary,
Right.
as much as a college of the traditional kind. I mean, the promoters of Keble College really wanted it to be unlike the older colleges of Oxford, which they thought were irredeemably secularized, and you know, all kinds of things went on there which they didn't like. So now Butterfield's, I think he was starting somewhere different. Where the similarity with Ruskin comes is in the constructional colour. And that ultimately comes from the buildings in Northern Europe and above all in Italy that both Ruskin and Butterfield admired.
Thanks, Geoffrey. You've written a lot about Victorian, indeed 20th century Oxford. Where else in Oxford do you detect the hand of Ruskin and the influence of Ruskinian nature?
And I found that a challenging question, actually, Stephen, because I don't think you do very much.
Oh, right, interesting.
Because Ruskin's view of nature is very sui generis. You know, it's not something that's shared by the whole of the Gothic revival. It's true that you can see some foliage carving and so on in buildings by Gilbert Scott, for instance, such as Exeter College Chapel, which is a very beautiful building, I think. But the building where I think you see it most, actually, is not in a Gothic building at all. It's actually in the interior of Worcester College Chapel, because there you have an architect who in many ways was quite like or quite followed Ruskin's ideals. And his name was William Burgess. He was highly original. He was very keen on following nature. And when he redecorated the inside of Worcester College Chapel in the Renaissance style, he brought in the craftsmen, particularly a man called John Nichols, who did all the beautiful and very lively gargoyle-like figures on the stalls there. If for anybody listening, if they haven't been into Worcester College Chapel, do go. It is a most fascinating building, and it, in many ways, it epitomizes the High Victorian style as much as Keble College, although using classical means of doing so through the early Renaissance.
Although, of course, you've got no idea of that from the outside.
No idea at all. It's it's a classical building of the kind that Ruskin and probably Burgess would have actually loathed. Yes.
Geoffrey, one last question for me before I throw things open to the floor. By the time Ruskin died in 1900, he was sadly half forgotten, and many of his contemporaries were, well, most of his contemporaries were dead. But does Ruskin and his view of the primacy of nature still strike chords today? Have we still got things to learn from Ruskin, do you think?
Yes, I think we have a lot to learn from Ruskin. I think, and in particular, in the whole environmental movement. In many ways, you could say that the environmental movement is has been influenced by Ruskin. Ruskin, you've got to remember, was one of the inspirations of the founding members of the National Trust, for instance. And a lot of his views on the natural environment are shared by people worldwide who are concerned with it. Let me give you an example. One of the things he wrote in his old age in the 1880s, was an extremely depressing pamphlet called The Storm Cloud of the 19th Century, in which he equated the industrial smog over the big cities with the decline of the kind of organic society that he believed had once existed and could exist in the future. Now that, I think, that has been echoed in a lot of the environmental movement. It's also been, other ideas have been echoed too. If you look at onto this last, it's basically a critique of money worship. And I think people worldwide who recognize that the pursuit of money is not necessarily the recipe for a good life would share that. Now, you could say cynically, oh, well, he would say that, wouldn't he, given that he inherited a large fortune from his sherry the sherry fortune of his father. But having said that, that doesn't actually diminish the relevance of what he wrote. So I would encourage any of you, again, it's the second time, to actually read this man and to read him in a sympathetic way.
Geoffrey, thank you very much. Any questions from the floor at all? If so, could you raise your electronic hand, please? Well, I can see instantly. Philip Ball, far away. And can you unmute yourself for a second?
Yes, when you go to Brantwood House, you're amazed by the exquisite draftsmanship that Ruskin showed. And in one of your slides, you had a very early photograph that you said was taken by Ruskin. Mm. What was his view of photography as it emerged during the 19th century? Just
that's a very interesting
views, or as an art form in itself?
Well, I don't think he thought very much of photography as an art form. For him, photography was a kind of aid memoir and an aid to doing beautiful drawings, because and the reason for that is that he thought a photograph was a mechanical thing. And he thought that art could only be good through bringing in the creative imagination of the artist through the pencil and the brush and so on. The photograph was a substitute. But you're absolutely right in saying that he did actually use photographs in his later life, and he felt that it could be a valuable means of teaching. Of course, he was very, one reason why I think of Ruskin as being partly a patron of Kellogg College is that he is very much in favor of continuing education and people being, continuing to learn throughout their lives. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you, Philip. Other questions, please? Nia, do you want to would you like to share that, or no? Can I just, Geoffrey, take you back to the University Museum? How successful was it, do you think, ultimately? I know everyone says, how flawed it was. How successful was it in terms of true to nature? Was it a failure? Obviously, as you mentioned, the carvings were never finished. How successful a composition was it?
Well, I think it was extremely successful, and I think it's, I mean, when I was a student in Oxford, the Victorian architecture was only just beginning to emerge from generations of people saying how awful it was. And I remember going there as a student under Keble College and being completely, gobsmacked by both of these buildings. And I've taken countless people around both of those buildings, and they absolutely love it. And the University Museum, I think, is successful because you're going from, you see this beautiful exterior, you go through a kind of tunnel, and then you emerge into this light-filled interior. with light coming through the glass roof. And then if you spend some time in there, and especially look at the detail, which of course is what you have to do in medieval architecture as well, then you can get enormous enjoyment, which in fact takes you back to nature. Because if you look at the carvings and the columns in the gallery, it makes you more aware. And again, this again is what Ruskin was all about, I think. So I think it is actually a very successful building. Where it's not successful is in fact the practicality of it, because the roof has had to be repaired over and over again, because it was, the glass roof was made at a steep pitch following the Gothic arches, the rainwater all went down into the gutters, and the university has had to spend huge sums of money recently on replacing. So from a practical point of view, it isn't entirely successful, but from an aesthetic point of view, and from the point of view of looking at dinosaur bones, if that's what you enjoy doing, and the stuffed crocodile and things like that, it's absolutely brilliant. Yeah.
I think it's one of the greatest interiors in, well, certainly in Britain, if not in the world. I mean, astonishing building.
Yeah,
and particularly now that wonderful vault has been, as you say, restored at a vast expense. If anyone else has a question, do register it on the chat. Sorry, I should have been more specific. But Ivor, you have a question regarding Turner.
Yes, thank you very much. Hello, Geoffrey.
Hello.
I studied Turner, or a bit of Turner anyway, many years ago, and I was quite interested, given the contrast really between the sorts of paintings that Turner painted, who I think was a long, long time ahead of his time, and a magnificent artist, and Ruskin's admiration for the Pre-Raphaelites. How you actually related to his perception and painting of detail, given that Turner's gives more imagination and an idea of what was there rather than a very strong depiction of it.
Well, I deliberately decided not to engage with that question. It is a paradox, there's no doubt about it. And I've thought about this quite a lot, actually. And I think the way Ruskin was very good at persuading himself of things. And the way that he persuaded himself that Turner was a natural artist in the same way as Pre-Raphaelites was that he was painting light. And Ruskin recognized that Turner had a greater genius than any of the Pre-Raphaelites, or possibly you could say all the Pre-Raphaelites put together. And he, when he wrote about this kind of thing, implied, I think, that the best the Pre-Raphaelites could do, or the best that anybody could do after Turner died, was to follow nature in detail, because until you could do that, you couldn't do anything else. That was the best you could do. And I think you had to wait till the next generation before an artist or artists came along who took up the Turner baton of painting light. And of course, we all think of the Impressionists, who actually were not that interested in Turner, I think. But the one who was, and who followed it in this country above all, was an artist who I still think is somewhat underestimated. And his name is James McNeill Whistler. And he actually took up this atmospheric, misty kind of Turner, the wonderful paintings he did along the Thames in the late 19th century are definitely Turnerian. And of course, Ruskin was alive then, and he would probably have dismissed them out of hand by that time. You cannot expect Ruskin to always be consistent. He isn't. He changes his mind. But how many of us are really consistent? And how many of us don't change our minds or believe two possible things at the same time?
Thank you very much. Geoffrey, a double question here. Do you feel it was inconsistent? Well, I suppose we all do. of Ruskin to deprecate Japanese art when it had at its core, one of its core components, a love of nature, albeit one very different from that of British art.
Yeah.
And indeed, in what sense did Ruskin's championing of the pre-Raphaelites, and as you say, of Turner, what else did he support, and why was he so rude to the Japanese?
Well, okay, let's do the second bit first. He didn't support all that much. After the pre-Raphaelite movement fizzled out, really, or at least the original pre-Raphaelite movement, you could say there's a second pre-Raphaelitism, which is Burne-Jones and his school, which had an enormous influence, of course, through Morris later on. But after it had fizzled out, he really mainly admired some pretty kind of small scale artists who painted flowers and so on and so forth. I mean, he liked Kate Greenaway, for instance, and and William Morris Hunt and people like that. Not Holman Hunt, and he really, I think, lost interest in the really interesting British artists. And then, of course, he crossed swords with Whistler, notoriously, by provoking this law case where he accused him of flinging a pot of paint in the public's face, which is rich coming from Ruskin, bearing in mind that Turner, in a sense, painted in a style that anticipates Whistler's in many of its manifestations.
And it really ruined Ruskin's reputation, didn't it? Although he was brought in damages of a farthing. Yes, that was his career sort of over.
Yes, but it didn't matter for Ruskin because he inherited his dad's fortune. It didn't.
and Sherry, yes.
It did matter for Whistler a lot. And he, of course, he eventually rebuilt his career, but it was a very instructive episode, let's say, in cultural history.
And do you think that is why that Ruskin, obviously through his enmity with Whistler, really failed to appreciate the Japanese influence of the
I think it is,
1870s,
yes. So coming
80s.
on to that, I think I think that's partly it. It's partly that we mostly know Japanese art, or at least knew Japanese art in that period, through their colour prints.
Yeah.
And given Ruskin's interest in minute attention to nature and actual kind of craftsmanship in painting with brush and pencil, he thought that a reproductive style like that, these artists who were painting to be, drawing to be reproduced, was not very good. And so I don't think he thought there was anything much to be learned from them. The people who did feel there was much to be learned were Whistler's generation and many later people. But by that time, of course, Ruskin had lapsed into virtually incoherence. I mean, the later stages of his life are very sad, actually. I think there was contradictions within Ruskin's personality, which never really went away and which kind of dogged him at the end.
Thank you, Geoffrey. I think we've got time for one final question.
Yeah.
Alison Fogg asked, what did Ruskin think of Darwin?
What did Ruskin think?
Did he know Darwin?
Well, he certainly knew of Darwin, because he knew of Darwin through the famous Huxley Wilberforce debate in the University Museum. To be quite honest, I don't know the answer to that question, and I don't feel I can, that anything I say is likely to add to it. But I imagine that it's something that wouldn't have passed him by, and I suspect he might, certainly the earlier Ruskin, the evangelical Ruskin, who believed, in the literal truth of the Bible, would not have liked Darwin at all. But as by the time that The Origin of Species came out, Ruskin was himself opening up his own ideas on religion, cosmology, nature, and so on. So it wouldn't surprise me if he hadn't read it, but I can't answer your question definitively, unfortunately.
Well, thank you very much indeed, Geoffrey. This has been absolutely illuminating hour, and I've certainly learned a lot more, and I'm sure we all have. And we'll rush off and not only drink some Ruskin sherry, but we'll also hopefully read some Ruskin the original, and hopefully too, please do have a look at some of his drawings. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
May I ask everyone to unmute and give Geoffrey a round of applause, please?
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.